Great. So with that, welcome everybody, especially any newcomers to our interest group. This session is going to focus on physical samples and specifically on our efforts to work towards a global and multidisciplinary network of fair physical samples. So now I have to figure out how I move slides forward here. Okay, no. Okay, so for those of you who may not have participated in any of the sessions of this interest group yet, I've just put up one slide to summarize the rationale for establishing the physical samples and running this physical samples interest group, and the topics that we have discussed and addressed throughout our existence. So the rationale from the beginning has been the need for more discoverable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable samples, because I'm sure everyone who has joined this session is in some way working with data acquired on physical samples or data describing physical samples. And we want studies that involve physical samples to be reproducible. We really want to make sure that that data is reusable, but also that the samples are reusable. And that means that they are described with sufficient metadata, that they can be properly identified, uniquely identified, and so on. And we want to make sure that samples, their collection, their curation, and their analyses are recognized as scholarly contributions and are integrated into the research data ecosystem. So the topics that have come up throughout our discussions have been persistent unique identifiers for samples, sample metadata and terminology, and as you probably saw, that is one of the major topics at our session today. The operation and creation of registries, catalogs, and harvesters to establish portals for discovery of samples and so on. Policies and practices for sample sharing and preservation. And it would at some point also be an important topic to talk about the actual physical infrastructure for archiving samples and making them accessible. We have, since we were accepted in 2017 as an interest group, we have been meeting at every plenary since then, as you can see here. With different topics, but increasingly really focusing on the FAIR aspects, vocabularies, and on the cross-disciplinary aspects of physical samples. Okay, so the session today has the objective to kind of function as a forum for a number of new and emerging initiatives related to physical samples in the research data ecosystem. It's been very encouraging, actually, that over the last few years, quite a number of very large-scale projects and initiatives have emerged, and we thought it was a good idea to use this session as an opportunity to update the community on their goals and activities, but also to start better networking among all these activities. Plus, we also then have to take the step to look for other RDA interest groups and working groups that can leverage our activities and our goals. And clearly with the broader research data ecosystem, the integration is highly relevant. What we want to achieve is convergence on sharing a vision and strategy for advancing fair samples. And that specifically in a cross-disciplinary manner so that science and society at large can benefit from these samples. So here's our agenda today. We have a short welcome, and this initial overview was already part of that. And I'm very happy to welcome a new co-chair. We will have a session that I mentioned, the forum of allowing new and ongoing activities for FAIR samples to introduce themselves and provide an overview of their activities, and then give everybody an opportunity to answer some questions, and also the audience of this session to comment and ask further questions. Then our third section is focusing on multidisciplinary vocabularies for physical samples, led by Leslie Wyborn. And last but not least, we will synthesize what came out of our discussions today and kind of identify next steps. So from the logistics point, I would please ask everybody who is on the call right now to fill in their attendance into the document. There is a table in the document that we have prepared for you to fill in your name and email address. A reminder that if any questions come up or comments throughout the session, please put them into the chat. We will try to address it during the meeting. If not, we will save the chat and make sure that we can get back to you after the meeting. And with that now, welcome to our new co-chair, Esther. And with that, I'm handing over to Esther. I will advance slides for you, Esther, right? But maybe you could start briefly introducing yourself. And we're very excited that Esther actually just recently received the CoData Connect Award for an essay she wrote about persistent identifiers. And I thought it would be a really good idea for Esther to kind of introduce herself to this community by giving a short summary of that essay. With that, go for it, Esther.
Thanks so much. So my name is Esther. I'm a data steward at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. I also did research. I analyzed the chemical composition of human teeth, and hence my interest in physical samples. I analyzed physical samples. I also have a background in archaeology, so physical samples are really present throughout all my research, which is why this interest group grabbed my attention during my first RDA plenary, which was the one in Helsinki, so about a year ago. Where I also found out that people sometimes forget about physical samples, because at one of the closing meetings, they did mention physical samples, but it was sort of like a reinvention, that data wasn't just electronic, we also have physical things. And yeah, so I really connected that back to this interest group. And that's also where the CoData essay was inspired from, because it just kept on playing in my mind, and I think it's a very important aspect of research. So I wrote a bit for the CoData essay. I'm going to copy paste the link in the chat. That's the actual text of the essay. The essay is not yet online. It's just past peer review. So if you do have any comments on the text or any suggestions, anything that I forgot, I'm very happy to still incorporate that. So please do let me know. Yeah, so and now we're here, and I'm a co-chair, which I am very excited about. Yes, next slide, please. And so just to briefly go over the essay, so you can go over the text yourself, but I very much focused on why we need persistent identifiers for physical aspects of research. I also named a couple of the best practices that I was aware about, but yeah, do please let me know if I missed anything. And I'm sure that after this session, I'm going to have to update the essay as well. And I also focus on the challenges that I saw, as well as a call to action for more community engagement, so that researchers are really aware of all of the facilities that are already there. And next slide. And so as for why, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but from my perspective, I would really appreciate having one identifier per sample or instrument so that I don't need to collect all of this information manually. I appreciate the information being publicly available, and this also helps with making that data publicly available. I think we could increase the access to samples, so reuse of data that was already mentioned. And credit is very important. For my own research, for example, it took me 2 years to collect all the teeth that I needed, in which no human being was harmed other than them already needed to be extracted in the first place. But it can take quite a long time. So I think we should focus more on crediting people for this work. Who doesn't like all information available in one location? And it also makes it easier to collaborate, especially if we can agree on vocabularies. And in principle, I just think that physical aspects are part of data and research, and fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable shouldn't skip these parts of research. Next, please. And so the essay also focused on challenges. So if we are going to have shared vocabulary, that's going to be a challenge because each discipline has its own data culture and jargon. And I'm sure Leslie can tell us all about this later on in the session. But I do think it would be very meaningful to establish core metadata so that we can actually meaningfully collaborate and reuse the same samples and answer new research questions. But in order to do that, we are going to have to organize research communities so that they can set up their requirements. Next. And that was it for me. So looking forward to your feedback and to your input in this session.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Thank you so much, Esther. That was great. I'm very excited to have you on board here with our interest group and co-chairing it. And yeah, please ask Esther any questions in the chat if you have any. So with that, we're moving on into the second part of our session. And we, as I said before, we have a group of panelists, presenters who are not going to present with slides, but just talk about their specific projects and initiatives that they represent. And again, write your questions in the chat if you have any. We also invite members of the audience after the last presentation to briefly describe any projects and initiatives that they are involved with or aware of that have not been listed above. So let's get going. I'm trying to see here. So I thought the first, whoops, there's something jumped a little ahead of us. First one is Alex Hardisty to talk about the interoperable enriched specimen information models. Alex, please say a sentence about who you are and what your background is before you get going.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night. My name is Alex Hardisty. I'm based in the UK, where I work at Cardiff University, actually in the School of Computer Science and Informatics. At the moment, I'm spending most of my time working on a large-scale European preparatory phase project for a new European research infrastructure called the Distributed System of Scientific Collections, DISCO, where I'm one of the lead technical architects for the data infrastructure that DISCO will need. And DISCO is a collaboration of more than 120 natural history museums and research institutes across 21 European countries. which has the aim to mobilize the data from the approximately 1.5 billion specimens that are held in research collections, specimen collections across Europe. And if you extrapolate that to the world level, then the estimates suggest that there are about 3 billion natural science collections, 3 billion natural science specimens in collections all around the world, in every museum, in town, city, university, research institute, plenty of them. And these cover preserved items, plants, animals, insects, vertebrates, invertebrates, rocks, minerals, meteorites, almost anything that occurs in the natural world is represented in these collections. And of course, these collections go back many hundreds of years, and access to them is quite difficult, of course, because it means that researchers who want to work with particular specimens have to either visit those collections where the specimens are, or they have to borrow those specimens. However, these days, with technology of digitization, it becomes increasingly possible to make data about those specimens and also data derived from those specimens available as units of information available on the internet. And increasingly, there are a range of data mining and machine learning techniques that can be used to carry out all kinds of research that perhaps hasn't been foreseen up until relatively recently, where access to the physical specimen itself is not required, but nevertheless, much of the data that is about or derived from those specimens does need to be accessed. And of course, in those collections, there are multiple systems of identification. There's no one unified system of identifying physical specimens in collections. And at the moment, we are not planning to unify a physical system of identification, because there are just too many difficulties about that. However, we have this notion of enriching specimen information models, and having derived information about specimens themselves, and we enrich it with links to third-party sources, to references to those specimens that occur in literature, or to DNA sequences that are lodged in GenBank and the European Nucleotide Archive, to habitat information, all kinds of other stuff. And this unit of knowledge needs to be identifiable on the internet and processable by both machines and by humans. Of course, traditionally, humans are the ones that have processed specimens and samples, but increasingly we're going to see that the data around specimens and samples is processed by machines. And this is quite difficult for people to imagine and to come to terms with, because it's a very understated part of the digital representation of specimen information on the internet. We're not working alone in this area. This idea of digital specimens, which has emerged in Europe over the last couple of years or so, like many innovations, we see the same or similar ideas emerging in other parts of the world almost simultaneously. In the USA, for example, the work of the Biological Collections Network on the extended specimen concept, the extended specimen network concept, is very similar to the ideas that we're developing in DISCO. I think that's sufficient for a short introduction. I'll make way for the next person. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. So we move on to our next presenter, which is Neil Davis. And Neil will give us an overview of iSamples, or the longer term is Internet of Samples. Neil, you're ready?
Yes, I've got my coffee. It's good morning from here. So from Alex's I'm on the other side of the world now in Tahiti in French Polynesia. That's where I'm calling from today. That's where I live. I'm based here. I'm the director of the University of California's GUMP South Pacific Research Station on the island of Moorea in French Polynesia, where I've been for the last 20 years. So I guess following up a lot of what Alex said, of course, I share very much, and I'll try not to repeat things. So from my perspective, personally, I've been working a lot on how to track biological samples from the field down the value chain, ultimately, often, but not always, into biological collections in museums, and often, sadly, not always, into digital repositories also. But how do we track and ensure that we trace everything that comes from the field events? So I'm director of a field station, so I'm particularly interested in how we connect the work in the field where specimens are initially isolated from nature and increasingly also from the built environment. How do we sample the natural world? Obviously, those samples are of very limited value unless we have at least a minimum amount of metadata around them. What's interesting, I think, is the metadata that we have from that sampling event. If you can get it captured at the beginning, identifiers applied as soon as possible in that chain, then we have much better chance downstream. So we do have to do a lot of legacy work now because we have a lot of specimens that are existing and are really important, historical ones. But we also have to recognize that we're generating more and more of these every day. And most of the specimens we'll be working with are the ones that we're collecting now and in the near future. So we really need to get this process into the hands of people who are doing the work at the coalface, so to speak. And so that's been my mission really at the field station end, but it needs to connect both up and down. We need to be able to refer from the origins and also to downstream uses. So working with biological specimens, primarily I started with a work on the Moorea Biocode project where we were genetically sequencing all the species on the island. And those specimens ended up in museums around the world and sequences in GenBank and elsewhere. And we needed to figure out ways of combining this across many different institutions, different countries in one very large project. But increasingly, the importance of these samples is they can be used not only in say, biological or ecological research, but some of those very same samples that we get from nature can be used in geological or anthropological research. And so iSamples is sort of bringing those domains together. And then if we're going to be able to use these samples in different scientific domains, we need to be able to communicate between those domains. And that means we have to have ways of mapping knowledge and the different terminologies and things we use in those domains across them. And then we can really see the value of the reuse of specimens in not just in the domain they were originally collected for, but in others as well. To do that, we need to understand what the process is. On the slide that was shown earlier, we see the different metadata that's needed, depending on what you're going to use that specimen for, that sample for in the future. It might end up being used in. So one thing we have to work hard on is trying to understand across the domains, what are the minimum amounts of information needed? What has to be collected straight away in the field, because there's no going back and getting it again. So if you don't collect it now, your area of reuse, and maybe you'll decide to do that because we only have limited resources, but at least you should do that with your eyes wide open. But if you could collect these metadata at this point, then you've left open the maximum amount of reuse in the future. And as we move down the value chain, those decisions need to be made often at every step along the way. So to do that, we need to really be talking across domains, biological, physical, and social domains in science of the future uses of these samples and specimens that come from those samples. There's another domain which I've also been engaged in two different ways, and I would call that the sort of it's part of social, but not really social science, more the sort of administrative or maybe the ethical, legal and social domain. And that's a really critical domain too, with a lot of metadata that's useful for administrations. So I'm field station director, so I have an interest in tracking the performance of what are we doing and what is it being used for, and that's who's doing it. And then there's important administrative reasons for that, and funders and others want to have that information available, because too often things, and this is very important for provider countries too often things end up being used downstream, but those places where it came from, which for them might be of great interest, can't reconstitute those data, or are not always informed about the knowledge that is generated. So the other side of that that administrative metadata domain are things like permits. There's rights to have a say over the use of things and the way things should be used. And so we have the care principles to match the FAIR principles. So how do we integrate all of this? And busy field researchers, need to have this infrastructure, and they ideally don't need to think about it. So we need to provide that. As I run a field station, we have boats and cars and labs and the things you need to work in the field. We need that cyber infrastructure right there with the researchers in the field too. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Moving on to the next one, which is Valerie Stanley. And Valerie will talk about the emerging samples cluster in the Earth Science Information Partner Federation. And just in between, before I let Val start talking, if you came in late, please go to the Google document that is our notes document and enter your name and email into the attendance list. Thanks. So Val, go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirsten. So hi, everybody. My name is Val Stanley. I am the Antarctic Core Curator at Oregon State University's Marine and Geology Repository. So good morning from Corvallis. I work at a marine sediment core repository. We have over 22 miles of sediment archived inside of our large cold room. We also host terrestrial rock drill cores from around the state of Oregon, as well as a dredge rock and other rock samples kind of collected by hand and hammer from around the world, a much smaller collection of those. I have a background working with curation of physical samples for the past 10 years or so. And so I guess this ESIP physical samples curation cluster sort of was brainstormed initially about over a year ago. Unbelievably, that was over a year ago now, out of a curators meeting. So this is a meeting that happens every 2 years where curators of repositories like the one where I work get together to try and talk about strategies and methods for curating samples and sharing information with each other, which is a really lovely and wonderful thing. But we wanted to find a way to continue those conversations in between these every other year meetings. And so that kind of comes into the conversation about identifiers and vocabularies and standards. But that is a larger community than just us core curators. So that sort of got expanded. And so I've been working with Sarah Ramdeen and initially Kelly Stroker at NCEI to talk about what these tools are or what are the conversations that need to happen. And we decided to work with ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partners, to develop a cluster specifically to discuss physical samples curation. So not only, identifiers and how to make them fair digitally, but also the infrastructure needs of folks working with these kinds of things. And also realizing that the discussion about curation is not specific to just geoscience samples, that there's a lot of good work that's been done in other communities. And so an important aspect of that is getting everybody to talk to each other. So that's why I'm very excited about this session and to get to know the RDA community a little bit better. So yeah, we had a kind of information gathering session this summer at ESIP to start hammering out ideas and come up with a proposal.
Johannes, kannst du bitte mal hier das Ding auch wegräumen? Hier dieses Gitter. Hier sind noch Stangen, die rumliegen.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
No worries. I thought I heard
So I wasn't aware that I was not muted. I'm muting immediately if I find it.
No worries. Not a problem. I'm in a room where the lights are motion sensitive, so if they turn out while I'm talking to you guys, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so where was I? Summer ESIP meeting. We had a really great discussion with some folks and came up with a list of ideas of things to discuss via maybe a set of webinars and eventually. So we put all, me being myself and Sarah Ramdeen, who's in the room here today, about putting together a proposal to ESIP to form this cluster. So good news, we are now official. We have been approved. So we're moving forward with that and plan to have a session at the next upcoming ESIP meeting to gather more community insights into what our next steps will be in terms of working groups, projects that we want to work on together, and also developing a robust webinar series for everybody to come and talk to each other. Yeah, so I think that's about it for me.
Well, thanks, Val. It's great to hear that the cluster was approved. Congratulations.
Yeah, I'm excited.
It really fits this RDA interest group very well. So, and as you mentioned, Sarah, she is next, and she is going to talk about the IGSN 2040 project that I'm actually closely affiliated with as well. So, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying, feel free to interrupt at any point in time, because you'll know the context and the history behind a lot of these things much better than I do. But hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Ramdeen. I am a data curator for CSAR, the System for Earth Sample Registration, and it's an allocating agent for the IGSN. So I want to give a little bit of background on what that is, and then I'll jump into the IGSN 2040. But for those of you who are not familiar, the IGSN is the global sample number. It's a globally unique persistent identifier for physical samples. The IGSN EV is the nonprofit implementation organization for the IGSN, which provides governance and also manages the technical infrastructure. And the way it's structured, it's a distributed system where there's allocating agents, of which, again, CSAR is one of them, which provides to the end user, the researchers, IGSNs for their samples. And so that's what my job as a curator is, to then review submitted sample metadata for accuracy and quality control checks, and then once approved, issue IGSNs to the user. So it's been fascinating because I had some things prepared to say, but it's just been wonderful to hear these different actual live examples of from Alex and Neil and from Val, where there is this need for something like a globally unique, persistent, resolvable identifier to help with the tracking and the management and the connecting of this metadata information back to the physical object, especially, and also watching the chat to see some of these conversations about needing to support things like reuse, even if it's something where the sample's been destroyed, but you still need to reuse the metadata or the resulting data that came from the analysis that destroyed the sample. And that's where the IGSN can help link some of these different materials, and also, again, as a way to do when you go outward in publications, so that someone can come back and find the particular sample at the particular repository that you're referring to. So it's a really broad ecosystem, and I won't get into big detail on it, but I wanted to set that up in order to then say, well, the IGSN EV is, again, the implementation organization, and it's been funded by the Sloan Foundation to conduct this work called the IGSN 2040 project, which is to redesign the current IGSN EV structure to create a global, scalable, and sustainable technical and organizational infrastructure for PIDs for material samples. So as part of this, the IGSN 2040 Steering Committee has been undergoing a series of workshops In particular, we're looking at the sustainable business model facet of this broader picture. In the past, we had done work with the technical infrastructure and redesigned some of the core services that the IGSN EV offers and how the processes behind how they work. And now the next step is to say, okay, well, what's our business model? And it's particularly important in regards to this concept of fair, again, as we've mentioned, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, because for the PIDs to be fair and trustworthy, you also need to make sure that the business that's offering these PIDs, is also sustainable as well. And we want to use these different services and know that they're going to be there in 5 or 10 years. So I get a resolvable IGSN, will it still be resolvable if something should happen to the organization, heaven forbid, different things like that. So, and that's part of this whole business model aspect. In addition to those different facets, we're also looking at the relevance of partnerships and collaborations as part of the sustainable model. This might go back to then these core services that the IGSN EV offers and say, well, what services can be outsourced? Which ones might benefit from a partnership with another organization, maybe perhaps reading a broader audience or more diverse audience? And then what things need to be maintained under the umbrella of the IGSN EV because of our core expertise. So while the IGSN first originated to serve the earth science community, it's being adopted in a broader range of fields, including environmental sciences and archaeology and biology. And as that grows, that's part of the value of the IGSN EV, is that we have this expertise within the community that makes sure that the core services that support the needs of those different domains are being voiced and articulated within the services. Kirsten, did you want to add anything to all of that?
No, I think that was fantastic, Sarah. Thanks for the overview. I wouldn't know what to add to that. It really hits the all the things that have happened. I mean, so maybe just to add is that we're expecting the final outcomes of this project to become available in spring 21. We have a couple more workshops to go and development of the roadmap for the IGSN EV. So yeah, plans are right now, the project will end in March 2021, and we expect that reports will become available then. So yeah, thanks, Sarah. That was great. Okay, now I have a bit of a challenge. Our last speaker is Alex Prent to talk about the Auscope Geochemistry Network. And this is a pre-recorded presentation. So I'm going to have to exit this and move on. And I hope, Sarah, can you just confirm that this is visible?
Yeah, I can see the screen and
Then
the Auscope
try
slide.
to get it started, and let's see that the audio works.
Hello, I'm Alexander Prent.
We can hear it.
Researcher at Curtin University's John de Leyden Center. And I'm also the coordinator of the Auscope Geochemistry Network. The aim of the Auscope Geochemistry Network is to create a national collaborative network of geochemistry laboratories. And with that, we'll help to facilitate national geoscience endeavors, such as creation of the Isotopic Atlas of Australia, which requires to have multiple geochemistry technique-specific laboratories to work as one. The AGN is supported by Auscope, which is part of Enriched, the National Research Infrastructure for Australia, an Australian initiative. The Auscope's purpose is to create wide and open access to earth science research infrastructure, and with that, to help solve national challenges and to build a resilient and sustainable nation. Our current team consists of institutes from Macquarie University, the University of Melbourne, and Goethe University. There's multiple data scientists and researchers from those three institutes, and we're supported by the Auscope headquarters, as well as the Lithodat team that help us build Geochem, the AGN's data platform that connects laboratories to a repository, research tool, and a data dissemination service. The AGN activities are, amongst others, the building of the repository, supporting open data initiatives, promoting investment in research infrastructure, supporting professional development, end user access to laboratory facilities, and the preservation of legacy samples and data sets. With the development of Geochem, we connect the laboratory to the repository, as said, but doing so, we still need to have sample metadata, because without a lithology, a latitude and a longitude, the analytical data is meaningless in the geoscience space. So the marriage of this analytical data with the sample minimum metadata can be a successful endeavor, or it can be a disaster. So what we've been doing in recent months with the AGN, we've looked
I think we might have lost audio.
data. Now, 5 fields we consider mandatory, and 4 fields we consider highly recommended. And ideally, if a researcher comes back from the field, they go to our Geochem platform, where they upload their sample minimum metadata, or at least their lithology and their GPS coordinates. Geochem then links in with the IGSN minting service, and each IGSN is required by the laboratories prior to analyses. So when you enter a laboratory, you give the lab your IGSN number, which is then linked to the data or included in the analytical data. That's then stored on the institute repository, which is also shared with a cloud storage repository, and then linked to Geochem relational database. Then we can visit that data, for which a placeholder was saved upon IGSN minting and registry. And that then can be viewed through a full access control layer on Geochem. So you can set your access controls for collaborators, or public or only private. Now, connecting that analytical data to the sample and the IGSN will make it future-proof. So as long as we can couple the IGSN to any analytical data, we'll be able to retrieve from where the sample was collected. Now, if you want to get in touch, here's some, feel free to email, have a look at the website, follow us on Twitter, and look at the YouTube channel on which we have recordings from various webinars held in the past. Thank you.
All right. I hope that went okay. Sorry for the brief loss of the audio. The reason that Alex is not here right now is that by now it's about 2 in the morning in Western Australia, and that was just not possible for him to attend. So that was our last presentation. And first thing I wanted to ask all of you in the audience right now, is there anybody else who knows about a project or is involved in a project that this group here should know about? I'm going to try to get my chat visible again, or Sarah, Esther, please let me know if anybody shows up in the chat as wanting to add something.
So far, there's no one in the chat and no one's raised their hand either to speak, but I can keep an eye on those while Esther takes notes.
Excellent. So, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the goal here really is convergence. There are obviously a whole set of very powerful projects that are ongoing or starting, and it is a critical aspect, I think, of building these infrastructures for physical samples, for digital physical and physical samples, to not fragment the landscape too much. We know there are different requirements in different communities. Just looking at the chat here, I can see the difference between samples that are very precious and are not destroyed in any way or subsampled on the one hand. On the other hand, samples that are basically curated in repositories in order to be reused and be subsampled and so on. But still, if we want to come to some more consistent procedures, practices, standards, data exchange standards, metadata, and so on around samples, I wanted to ask the speakers now, what do you see as something that needs to happen from the perspective of your initiative to better connect with others, to better integrate? Are there activities of this RDA interest group? Do we need working groups in addition to an interest group? Or do we need to form new types of organizations? So yeah, again, I'm a little lost in not being able to see participants. If you want to raise your voice, or we can go around, and Alex, you start, and then we give Neil a chance, and so on.
Okay, what's important for us in the biological collections community, and not just the biological collections, because of course natural history, natural science collections extend into geological collections as well, is to arrive at a converged and standard means of representing the digital data that's derived from physical specimens. We fully understand and accept that that physical specimens need to be curated and accessible, and that there are extremes on the spectrum, as you've described, from those physical specimens that should never be touched because they're too precious, and those which are routinely subsampled. But we see that there's a distinct difference between the physical specimen and the data that's derived from the physical specimen, and so we're embarking upon a specification for what we call open digital specimens as the container for bringing together that derived data and the links to that derived data. We see this as very important.
Thanks. Neil, do you want to add your perspective?
Yeah, no, one thing that occurred to me afterwards was the importance, if we're going to track everything from field downstream and across, as well as across domains, of course, but the importance of data management plans, and particularly machine actionable data management plans. We need to get this embedded into those plans so they can be applied as early as possible. I mean, and those obviously need to be planned before you make the collections. So I just think that DMPs and linking with efforts to develop machine actionable data management plans is really significant, that we combine these efforts. And just along those lines, we've involved in a project called the Fair Island Project, which is really focused on kind of imagining a utopia, an island where everything you could imagine had been implemented. A little atoll with a new research station, which we're kind of using as that utopia. And what if you could build the best possible data management policy that the governor or the owner of that island applied, and then all the research community followed those instructions? What would that ideal data management policy be? And then how would you implement it with different tools to ensure that it works? And then, because we can actually do this in the real world, can we demonstrate the benefits? What are you able to do that you weren't able to do doing business as usual? So really, that's, I think, another crucial thing, is having the case studies, the examples, the demonstrations of, hey, people who followed this. Maybe it's a little challenging at first to follow these approaches. These are all the benefits that came from that, and to really document those and to show those benefits accrue to people at all stages in the value chain, and across the different domains, even if it's not you necessarily who are downstream finally putting it all together, that those benefits and credit flow back upstream to those who contributed.
Thanks, Neil. And I'm sure we're all going to come to the island and help you implementing the policy. Val, do you have any comments?
First, I just want to comment that I thought everything Neil said just sounded fantastic. So thanks for that. I mean, I think from where I'm at, I think, there's so many things that need to be worked on. And I love this, making sure that everybody is in the room and figuring out kind of what directions need to happen first. But from my perspective, just kind of figuring out what the standards are and streamlining workflows and sharing both of those things, protocols, standards, making those official, and kind of getting the community to know how to approach working with physical samples, researchers as well, not just the curators. Kind of what do they need to know? Those are my thoughts right now.
Thanks, Val. Sarah?
Yeah, sorry, I was answering a question Maggie had in the chat. But,
yeah, you're multitasking. I can see that.
But I think it's an interesting question too, just as far as I think it relates to her question. That's why I bring it up, is it's that engagement of, we can build the best tools and develop the best systems, but it's getting the people to engage them that's very important. And sometimes that happens through the spaces to have the communication with each other and learn from what's being done in other places, and to educate people on what options are available. But I think also finding the way for the community to come up with those messages that are easy to sell to our researchers who don't come to these forums is also important, but that's also something we can do together as well.
Great. Well, I can't ask Alex to contribute. An answer. I'm not sure if Leslie, you want to take Alex's role and say something from the perspective of the AGN.
No, other than it's a very young group in Australia, and I'm amazed how the whole process of getting the geochemical data into the database system that they're building starts with you having an IGSN on your sample, and if you don't have it, you don't get into the next downstream bit, which is the analytical data that is generated from that sample. I'm quite amazed at what they're trying to do. That'll be about all I'd say.
Thanks, Leslie. So actually, I mean, I see that we basically reached our time limit, but I wanted to leave one more question to Esther, actually, because she was the one who came up with the questions here and designed that. And, as the last, basically nearly everybody can refer to the involvement of communities and, better reaching out to those who implement, and the question of, are we missing any stakeholders? So Maybe Esther, where were you coming from with this question, and where would you like to see things go?
So I'm mainly coming from the question from the researcher side of things, because I wasn't very much aware until a year ago that all this infrastructure exists. And I'm pretty certain that most of my colleagues are only starting to develop this, or are trying to reinvent the wheel for practices that are actually already there and could be reused. And so it is indeed important to reach out to them and use language that is also speaking to them. And I think that is quite difficult, because this is, of course, not the only thing that is on their minds. Trying to think back of things that were said. Someone said something. I'm also taking the notes, but I can't find back where I put it. Sorry. About involving and well, basically also what Sarah says, that we need to educate people and yeah, reach out to people. So that's also what I try to do with the essay. So if I just have something that is published, or something with some clear benefits, where people think like, okay, well, maybe this says something because it's peer reviewed, and then it must have some word to it. Let's see how we can engage with it, or at least have more increase awareness and make it as easy as possible for researchers. So basically, what I think Neil said, that it needs to be there in the field already, and they don't need to think about it. It just needs to, you need to fill it in. And that also links back to what Leslie said. If you don't have the IGSN, I'm sure I'm mingling letters up, sorry. If you don't have it, you cannot continue. And that's a really good drive for people to actually make sure that they do have it, and otherwise they can indeed not continue. So these steps are, I think, very important. And I think I'm slightly rambling, so I'll keep it at that.
No, thanks, Esther. I think that was great, because it kind of synthesized important points. And just to add that actually the IGSN 2040 project, with respect to its business model, has been talking a lot about the need to create broader awareness of the existence of the infrastructure and the necessity for the infrastructure. So it fits really well. Great. This was really a great discussion, and I hope we can follow up in some way after this session. But for now, I really want to hand over to Leslie. Oh, this is Leslie. Let me know when I need to advance slides for you.
Okay, so if you could move the slide to the first slide. I think we've talked about the business model and a few infrastructure systems, but I think there's one thing that's starting to come out, in that one size does not fit all. You cannot have a common vocabulary for all samples around the world that fully describes them. And so I just want to highlight some work we're trying to do in a couple of groups, and invite you to participate. Next. When I say IGSN goes viral, it was like watching your child get into those teenager years. We initially started it in the geosciences, and it's used in many other domains, and no one vocabulary will describe all samples. Within each domain, the same attribute can have different names. And so if we're going to make the descriptions of the samples interoperable, we need to be very specific about what term we are using and where it is sourced from. And I think this is where things like science at schema.org and linked data, things that just weren't even in existence when we started this system about 10 or 12 years ago, are now going to be, if you like, our lifesaver. Next. And so again, this is just something that I had to put something in that's Australian. And so even within the same state of Australia, we do use different terms for exactly the same thing. And it's that understanding in Australia, we have it because if you want to get a decent glass of beer, you've got to know what term to use when you're in each state. And that's the same thing here. If you're doing an archaeology sample or teeth sample or a rock sample or a water sample, what is the terminology that you are going to use even within the same community? Next. Oh, again, next. Sorry. Okay. And so this is where we developed our famous bullseye diagram. And if you want more on it, I've just put a link in the chat where this is a poster. Sorry about the horrendous link, but I've got a poster on this, which I've got to stay awake for at 7 a.m. my time. But what we're actually saying is that there is a common kernel, and then you can go out in these rings around it, and each ring is a vocabulary that a community agrees to, and so you can mix and match and you can swap as long as that vocabulary you use is in controlled namespace. And you can create then what I call a vocabulary agnostic system to the whole process of IGSN, but we have to get each community together to say, these are the terms and this is the vocabulary. You've got to be very specific that I am going to use. Next. And I think this is something that's coming in which will help us no end, is the FAIR implementation profiles. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of talks on this at this RDA plenary. But a FIP is a collection of implementation choices made by a community of practice around the FAIR principles. They themselves can be captured as FAIR data sets and then made openly available to the community and register. So really, this is just a heads up of some work that we're doing, partly IGSN 2040. I guess the main thing we want to know is globally, what is the minimum metadata that you need to describe a sample? And we want it to be minimum. I know there's problems with that, but we've got to have agreement for this registration process to make it globally unique. But then for each community to say, well, to describe an archaeology sample around teeth, these are the attributes that make it shareable and reusable. That is the metadata of the sample. And I think I'll finish there and pass on to, I think, Sarah's the next one.
Yes, Sarah will talk a little bit about the outcomes of the ESIP plenary session on the proliferation of vocabularies in solid earth space and environmental sciences. Are there any slides, Sarah, for that here?
No, I was just going to read a few things. I didn't think to put it in the slides, sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine.
So ESIP is Earth Science Information Partners, and I think it's already been discussed a bit, so I won't get into that, but feel free to ask if you have questions. But at this plenary, the focus was to discuss the various actions and activities needed surrounding the wider range of vocabularies and other semantic assets like ontologies, taxonomies, concept maps, knowledge graphs, etc., within this community space. And they had 6 different breakout sessions, and one of which was focused on physical samples. And so I want to bring back that conversation here to this community. And in particular, within that physical samples discussion was this need for a common core of metadata, which can support discipline agnostic services such as search and discovery, which is of particular interest, I think, again, to this RDA community because it takes it that step outside of earth science samples only or environmental sciences and says, okay, well, how can we make something discoverable so that it can support interdisciplinary work as well? So in the breakout group, they addressed 3 key questions. Is there a need for multidisciplinary vocabulary space for physical samples? And the answer was an emphatic yes. I think this group wouldn't exist otherwise as well. The second question was, what are the recommendations for the scope of such a vocabulary space? And so some of the things that came up was that it needs to be machine readable with some level of standardization. But also getting back to what we talked about earlier with community is that there also needs to be user buy-in for it to succeed. And so the final recommendations the final question was, what are some recommendations for a kickoff activity to establish such a vocabulary space? And things that came up there were, again, community education, the idea of perhaps a technical sprint related to vocabulary, so bringing together people from different communities and spending a 2-week time working together, not full 2 weeks, but like little engagement activities where you come together, discuss some plans, separate out, and then report back in to make some progress on the vocabularies for physical samples. And then the final point was the need to engage communities such as this RDA interest group and the newly formed ESIP physical samples cluster in these discussions. So I think the main takeaway is bringing back and reporting in some of the work that's being done in other communities, and then making sure that this community stays engaged in that process. So as part of that, I want to do a pitch too for the ESIP RDA Earth and Space Environmental Science Interest Group has a session in the next Breakout and Breakout 2 where they've been working on a catalog of vocabularies and ontologies, and I can put the link into the chat for that as well. But I encourage you, if you have time, to attend that plenary. Leslie, was there any other points that you wanted me to bring up from the that session? Because I'm just reporting again narrowly on the physical samples breakout, but there were 6 other ones as well, and I don't know if there are other takeaways you felt this group needed to hear.
No, it's just like what you're experiencing in samples is happening everywhere. There's just a proliferation of vocabularies. And so if we know about them, what can we do to cut down on the unnecessary duplication? Some duplication is required, but not as much as we've got. I've also put a link in the chat to the session that Sarah referred to, and you can look at the notes if you want to. And I think in the interest of time, we better move on.
So it's you, right? You continue with engaging the audience now on identifying existing and emerging vocabularies. Hello?
Did we lose Leslie?
I'm not sure. Yeah, it sounds like it.
What did I do?
Well, aren't you continuing here?
Oh, okay. All right.
It's very early in the morning for Leslie, so.
Yeah,
yes,
no.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to copy the chat. So I guess there's 2 strands, one of which is related to my poster, which is whether or not there's a group here that wants to participate in trying to, I'm not going to use the word minimum because it sets Ted Haberman off. I like Alex's comment, sufficient metadata. Is there a group here that would like to participate or let us know? Because see, again, once we move out of, like at the moment, there's been too much from Geo. And already, even, which is surprising in Geo, for example, we don't make the location. We're very careful about that because some locations are extremely sensitive. But to me, the low-hanging fruit would be perhaps if a group amongst us wanted to start to work on that minimum profile. I think once you blossom out into, say, archaeology and minimum metadata for geosamples, that becomes community specific. And I kind of don't know what granularity that will be done at, whether it'll be a local community or an international agreed one. But I guess what I'm going to ask is, are there people that want to get involved in defining the minimum metadata or sufficient metadata for discovery and connection? I hope that keeps Ted happy.
I mean, just adding to that, I thought, you know, what Sarah said with respect to a sprint in organizing some set of activities over a given shorter time frame of a week or 2 weeks with, you know, focused sessions, that seems to me a really great idea, because it's so tough these days to to work on development, consensus building, and so on together, and just doing that over a focused time would be a great thing, and I would love to participate. So maybe in our notes documents, people can volunteer or show their interest for it.
We're getting a few +1s in the chat box.
Great.
I guess I don't know how to do this, but maybe that could actually be a product of this group here, that we use the RDA working this interest group to actually try and pull that together, because we certainly are pretty global. And the other thing which I'm fascinated by is I've checked in the notes, the breadth and depth of sample types we've got at this meeting is just probably one of the best we've had in any of our plenaries. It's pretty exciting how many we've got.
So are there, I just want to, we basically still have 15 minutes for discussion, and I think the synthesis here emerges to be these activities that would follow up on our session. I wanted to encourage more feedback from the audience here. I think you can unmute yourself, I was told, so go ahead. I still can't see the chat, unfortunately, so if anybody has raised their hand, it needs to be Esther or Sarah to let me know. I see Kirsten.
Yeah, I just added a line in the notes document where we can all, who are interested in joining Leslie's group, I'm calling just Leslie's group, but what she just proposed. So I think it's easier than, well, we should copy the chat anyway, but we can all put our names down there.
Yeah, we definitely have to store to save the chat. That's
Sarah's and I've been, mainly Sarah's been progressively capturing it the whole time as we've been going, to avoid that deadly thing of Zoom. When you leave the meeting, you lose the chat.
We've got great teamwork here too, with Esther taking the notes.
great. Yeah, I mean, please, everybody from the audience, step forward. Let us know. What do you think? What would be a low-hanging fruit activity? Any alternatives to running a sprint on vocabularies? So many folks online. Take your courage, your voice, raise it.
Go on, I will.
Good.
Because I've been watching the chat as well, and you know, and have contributed to the debate about, you know, minimum information versus sufficient information, and the fact that you need different quantities of information for different purposes. You know, you need a different set of information for access than what you need for discovery, and similarly for, you know, for other purposes. And I'm also trying to reconcile in my head several things that I know about. One, you know, listening to Neil talking about the need to capture everything from the beginning of the gathering event in the field, you know, so that nothing is lost, and you have all the contextual information that's associated with samples, etc. And listening also to my colleagues in Disco, where they all have different understandings about what is meant by the term digitization and what information you collect out of digitization. And at one extreme, you've got all of this metadata and stuff for discovery and accessibility that Neil wants, and at the opposite extreme, some would say that, well, just the physical specimen identifier and the institution where the specimen is located is all you need. I don't believe that's true for 1 minute, but it is the other end of the spectrum. And so before you can start to talk about the vocabularies, you need to set the scope of this vocabulary. What is the purpose for which the vocabulary is being defined? What is in its scope and what is out of its scope? What are the criteria that it has to meet? Otherwise, I think you waste a lot of time with people talking at cross purposes because they have a different understanding of what the objectives are. Did that help?
Excuse me, this
Yes.
is Claudia from Brazil. May I say a couple of words
Great,
to this
absolutely.
very interesting discussion? Okay. I've worked a lot with different groups, and right now with over 100 different scientific groups trying to find a way, a consensual way to handle their metadata. And by doing, from all fields, okay, from A, astronomy to Z, zoology. And we have read several papers that try to unify metadata as much as possible. And everybody comes to the conclusion that there is a limit, okay? And the limit is, let us say, for findability, besides what whoever has said, institution and institution's location, are keywords and textual description. Barring that, you end up with, oh, you know, blood samples cannot be described like that. Animal vomit, with which I've worked, cannot be described like that. Cancerous tissues cannot be described like that. Plants cannot be butterflies, insects, whatever. Okay, so I think the scope is very important. But perhaps looking at previous work on trying to unify metadata in institutions to help people cooperate across multiple fields might help, okay? Because if we want to handle everything, we will reach nothing. Why don't I offer to work in this group? Because I'm already working in 3 other groups. And I have to teach, and I have to write papers, and I spend most of my day not eating because I have too many webinars I have to give. Okay, but this is a topic that's very close to my heart, and it's extremely important. Thank you. Sorry for taking up your time talking too much.
Not at all, not at all. I'm very delighted to hear your perspective. This is great. And we really hope you're gonna stay engaged with what is gonna emerge from this. So I think we, just kind of with one leg already moving into the final part of this and synthesizing and thinking about next steps, that the work on, the core metadata and the structures of modularizing metadata according to disciplinary requirements, but also according to purpose, as Alex was talking about. They're very different components of metadata. That would be a really important thing. And I really think that we can start with organizing some focused discussions just on that. The other thing that I clearly heard throughout the discussions is this need for creating more awareness of, what is already available, what, the relevance of the physical samples, and they're actually part of open and reproducible science is what needs to happen is, to me, I mean, that's something fundamental to this issue. And I wonder if there are ideas how the interest group could, in some way more effectively contribute to growing awareness. How can we use the RDA as a whole, I would say, for that? And what other venues may we have to reach a broader audience, reach more stakeholders in this field? Kirsten?
I think Pitapalooza could be a place, and we have already presented there with IGSN, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Because that's all about pits, so it would be natural to.
We
join them.
actually, there is going to be a session at the next Pitapalooza in January 21 that was organized by Laura Hark, formerly at ORCID, and myself. I think it will be a really fun session. So stay tuned for that. But, you know, I also think that there is a huge challenge, but opportunity in reaching out to academic institutions that manage a lot of samples. I mean, there are lots of researchers in all kinds of disciplines at universities or other research institutions. And, you know, in order to kind of maximize impact of an outreach activity, I would think it is really relevant to reach some of the sort of research administration at universities and making them aware that the samples their researchers handle and store are actually a huge asset. So I wonder if anybody has some thoughts about you know, opportunities, ways to reach that group of stakeholders. Nobody, come on. I know
this is Maggie Hellstrom. I don't know if I can answer your specific question that you posed right now, but I do think that what is needed are, and which also was reflected a bit in one of the questions I posted in the chat earlier, is that one needs very clear arguments to present to the people that you are talking to. You should do this because, and then something that is really illustrating the benefit to people, not just because somebody said you have to, but because you can further your academic career in this way, or you make your science more or less susceptible to fraud or things like that, to really highlight good things. And I also think it would be great if one had like a short flyer with a couple of FAQ things like why should I do this, because, etc. And then you could easily translate that into different languages and reach different disciplines and regions.
Reminds me of the 23 things that came out of the library's interest group.
Very similar to that.
Yeah,
yes.
so maybe creating something like that, especially what you're saying about getting it translated into the different languages.
Yeah, I love that idea to really make it available to a global community by making, you know, by translating and talking in the same language. I really like that. That's, and the arguments, you know, one task that we've talked about once in a while is really collecting stories of the impact of samples being reused, being findable. You know, I remember one story of cores, I think it was in the state of Wisconsin, where cores were suddenly discovered that told a story about natural resources in the state that had a huge impact on the state budget. Those type of, you know, really experiences over time where the discovery of samples, the reusability of samples had a big impact both on science and on society. So kind of coming up with a way to gather these stories, it's a tough one, but it would be a very powerful one, I think.
So if I can add there, I think there are also some other aspects that we haven't really been talking about today, and that's like ethical aspects. Especially maybe if you are out collecting samples, let's say a botanist goes to the Amazon to look for plants that could potentially have medical benefits, right? And then you also have to connect this to the indigenous population. You have to defend why are we doing this? How can the things be coupled back to the people whose knowledge it was really essential for this sample collection to be effective and happen at all. And I think those are aspects that we are all aware of, but we don't maybe necessarily know how to deal with them, how to ensure that this is also part of the metadata. So if one could also point to those kinds of arguments, I think that also raises the whole issue about having good sample metadata, sample identification systems, etc., to a different level, and also it brings in other stakeholders than that we maybe thought about initially.
No, this is a really important point. Thanks so much, Maggie, for raising this. It has come up before. I actually remember in Gaborone at our session, a researcher at the Gaborone Geological Survey or Geoscience Institute, I forget what the exact name of the institute was, but she was talking about, specifically specimens being taken from the country that are then not traced back and not provided, a linkage to the country and to the sort of ownership of the people of Botswana. It was a really great story that she told about a meteorite falling in the Kalahari and how people from all over the world traveled to grab that meteorite. And so there's a lot of ethical aspects in sample collection and sample dissemination and credit.
Anne Tambon, can I come on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
I just wanted to say that on samples from human beings, there are a lot of work on these aspects. For example, there are some examples of metadata around the consent. So in order to know what you are allowed to do or not to do with a collection of samples, you may have information, so metadata around the kind of consent forms that has been signed by these persons. So it's giving information on what you are allowed to do or not, for example. So that can be there are some classifications also of consent. Of course, it's not as precise as having the exact template of the consent form of a given person, but it gives you orientation so that you don't try to access and go for getting permission and so on if you know already from the start of your searching of findable samples, what at least the scope of what you are allowed to do or not. For example, if there is a collection of cancer samples coming from cancer patients, you may have some indication of it can only be used for, I don't know, a given type of cancer, or if it can be used for more different kind of cancer or other diseases, for example. So I think that characterizing for these kind of samples what you are, but through metadata, what you are allowed to do or not to do can help directing the search.
No, this is a really great point and kind of brings us back to these kind of modules of metadata that are more yeah, purpose oriented. You know, what do you need to describe for archiving? You know, there may be environmental considerations, but there are the ethical considerations, permits, and so on. And I think this is giving us a lot of, you know, really good ideas for where the development of these core metadata and the shells around the core need to go. So I noticed that we're actually beyond our time allotted until, well, for me it's 7:30 at night, but it's so many different time zones in the day starting, the day ending. So I thought this was a really great session. I thank you all for attending and for contributing. Lots of, you know, new perspectives I think that we had. And my idea, you know, that is forming slowly but surely is that we absolutely shouldn't wait for the next RDA plenary, virtual plenary, to have another meeting of this interest group. I think that we need to follow up over the months until the next plenary takes place with some focused meetings that address or offer new opportunities for more detailed, more in-depth discussion on some of these aspects. I like the aspects of ethical considerations around samples, about the outreach and education and the proper arguments for creating interest and willingness to listen, the metadata, obviously. So there's a lot that we can get going. With this, I wanted to just leave a brief opportunity for my co-conveners here, for Esther, for Leslie, to say some final words if they want to.
No, other than this has been really useful. I notice a few of you have got the care principles. If you're interested in that, there's a few sessions coming up. But again, that's the part I love about RDA, because we can do what we like, what we're doing within samples, but other groups in RDA help provide us with additional context. So look, this has been really great. Thank you very much for all your suggestions, and we'll definitely try and follow up in between plenaries. And I'll ask Esther now. Do you want to make any comments, please, Esther?
Yes, thanks. I would also just like to thank everyone for their input in the chat, and all the presenters, of course, for providing updates and their perspective. So thanks so much.
Just one note.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I'm not a panelist. I thought it was over and just wanted to leave you with a question, you know. But let me listen to the panelists first.
I just wanted to say to be sure to go to our page on the RDA site and join that community. That way you'll get the email communications about any meetings we might have in the future.
Okay. With that, I will stay on for a second, Sarah, just to make sure we have a safe chat. But otherwise, I wish you all, I mean, we're only at the start of an intense week of RDA sessions. So I hope you're all going to enjoy. You don't fall asleep by Friday with everything you're doing and having to stay up at night and whatever. But really enjoy it. And thank you all again for joining this session. Take care.
Can I just ask you, all of you, a question that has come to my mind? Perhaps we should ask ourselves, what's the main difference in terms of metadata and usages between physical samples and digital samples? Okay, we can set fire to or eat or drown physical samples, and we can't destroy digital samples, but ethical considerations at the end will be more or less the same. And so what are the differences that are required? And with that, I have to go and teach. So I'm so sorry. I'm already late for my class. So
But thank you for your contribution. Good
no,
thing.
this was a most wonderful session. Thank you so very much. Sorry. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks,
Oh,
Kirsten.
hi, Ted and Erin. I saw you on there.
Yeah, we're having some internet challenges at Copper today, so we're in a little bit of a limited.
Oh, God. Yeah. I went through this very smoothly. I'm surprised. I mean, I had the video off, but it all worked out.
Yeah,
So
I think-
where is the way to actually save the chat?
You go,
I think we've got it all.
Yeah, we've got it. And what it does is whoever was the host, it will after you close it saves a file to your computer.
Oh, okay. I'm the host. I was made the host at the very beginning.
Yeah,
So
but we've got, I think Leslie and I have it all copied into the notes
excellent.
document.
This was really great. Yeah, think there was so much new engagement. So I think we have to follow up. Let's get together soon as the co-chairs of the group and try to lay out some timelines and strategy. Great.
Okay.
So with that, I'm going to check if my granddaughter is already asleep or.
I'm going to go and get breakfast.
Oh, goodness.
Good luck, Leslie.
So when's that ES session?
It is the one that's at 1 a.m. for you, I think, Kirsten.
Oh, that's the 1 a.m. Well, I'm
Don't worry about it.
supposed to be in the domain repositories together with the repository platforms. So
Yeah, that's right. I knew you had a bad clash.
Yeah.
But it was
Okay.
nice to meet you, Esther, and thanks so much for all your help with taking notes.
Yeah.
Thanks
you. Right.
for the whole session. Thanks so much. And also, maybe
We'll
just
get you more involved in future.
that would be great. We'd love to contribute further. And also, just a quick follow-up on your last question on how to get people more involved. Have you ever been in contact with research support at the library? Because that's also where most of the data management initiatives are arising from, at least in the Netherlands. So maybe they
No,
could be a
I
natural.
really haven't done that. I think it's really an important aspect, and there is a person on the steering committee of this IGSN 2040 project who comes from the library. What is it? Indiana? Leslie Gary Motz. He has really made a big change at his university in creating awareness about samples and has gotten the library to actually take in the first collections of physical samples and take care of that. So he is very engaged in, the identifiers for samples and really registration of samples. He has sort of a foot in the university and a foot in the geological survey there, but it's a very good point.
What was his name again? I would love to have a chat.
Gary Motz, M-O-T-Z.
Okay, great, thanks.
But I do think, I forget who suggested it, but the idea of creating a simple document like the 23 things.
Oh, that was Maggie.
Maggie. Yeah, okay. I couldn't remember if it was Maggie Claudia, but I think that's a great idea and maybe a great outcome too for this, something like, as Esther's saying, that could go to the library so that the librarians could say, oh, you have data needs around samples, here's this brief.
And it links
Yeah, it would be
into
perfect.
many of the things that were said, the data management plans and
The why, the how, and the what parts does it.
Right. It's a really great idea that could even, then come up to the RDA higher level as an outcome.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So that might be a good idea for a working group to develop that over the course of a year.
That's just what I was going to mention, but I'm not sure I wanted to go through it. Having done a working group with the data versioning area, that is an option to do like the minimum metadata, or there's 23 things as a working group. But I get a bit scared off by it because it takes you forever to get your case statement up, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's not a good thing. That Sarah needs to take that on to make it easier for people and
I was
talk
going to say,
about
if
it.
someone else wants to lead it, I can assist with it since I was on the, Esther, I was on the technical advisory board for RDA who reviews the case statements for interesting working groups. So I can definitely help with that. It'd be great though if somebody else could take lead, and maybe someone who knew from this meeting today might be interested in that.
Yeah.
Like Maggie.
I also love the fact that we had somebody from Brazil on, that brings.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Yeah.
She comes regularly.
I have some recent experience with setting up a case statement, so I can't promise anything for this year, but I would definitely be interested in setting up like this flyer thing to make it easier to communicate, yeah, the benefits and everything. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, let's work on that. I'm
the
really excited
issue
about
with
that.
the issue with the working group is once you get the case statement up, then they really hassle you for 18 months. You've got to go to every plenary and you've got to produce something. And it's a real nightmare. But there again, I guess the advantage is when you produce something, they then look after it and promote it as a
Well,
product.
I'm specifically interested in it from the perspective of the IGSN 2040 project, because we've been talking about, more reach needed and so on. So I can justify actually dedicating some resources to this and help with layout, maybe, design elements or something like that, or hiring somebody for translations and so on, that I would be more than happy to support that. Okay, I don't want to keep you all from breakfast or from dinner.
Kirsten, do you have just a second to stay on after everyone else goes?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
It was hard getting up at 4 a.m.
Oh God, I can't even.
For you.
Yeah, my heart goes out to you for that.
I'm getting too old to do this, girls. Anyway, I must go. Bye.
Thanks so much, Leslie. See you around.
Bye.
Bye.
Just a quick question. Did you see the emails from Susan and Laura last week about setting up meetings with partners this week?
Oh, good. No, I mean, I saw that there were messages, but I've been having a hard time to just survive and keep up even, now I have to, for the next day, I just have to focus totally on this keynote that I have to give on Wednesday. But okay, maybe I have the.
Well, one of the reasons why I asked is Susan just sent me an email while we were wrapping up asking about, she's worried about time loss and she understands that you're busy and she wonders if instead we should engage some of the steering committee members to help with the partnership meetings instead.
Yeah.
She sent it to just me, the email.
Oh, she just send it to you.
Yeah,
okay.
And she asked if I could meet with her and Laura today. And so that's what I was wondering, if what you thought about that. If you're not available this week, should we try and get maybe someone from the steering committee?
I mean, I'm available Thursday, Friday. Maybe I don't need to be on everything, but I would like, I would definitely like to be at the meeting with Data Site and GBIF, if that's at all possible. Thursday, Friday are fine for me. It's just that I have this keynote Wednesday afternoon. It's a 4-hour workshop. Actually, it lasts from 1 to 5 Central European time. So anything in the evening at 8 or at 9 o'clock is fine with me.
In the evening on Wednesday? Okay. All right. So yeah, I'll answer her email now and meet with them and then see what they think, and then I'll follow up with you.
And I'll try to respond to their emails as well.
Okay. Yeah, I had to apologize. I didn't get to them till Friday, and they had needed stuff by Thursday, so it was one of those things where I think we're all behind.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems my backlog is getting longer and longer.
That's something. Yeah, I wanted to talk about at the team meeting. I can't. I'm just super behind in some things that I just can't get to because I have too many things going on. And Sam coming on is well timed, but also training him is meaning I'm getting
You
farther
see,
behind in
that's
some.
always the problem. You know, it's in some way, you know, our group has grown, and you know, you feel like, oh, with all these people, you know, and I feel my time is more in demand since then. You know, there's just more to coordinate, to organize, to, yeah. I mean, it really becomes obvious that, you know, with Astromat and eye samples and the critical zone and so on, it's just a lot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
NSF doesn't never recognize how much, you know, these just, I mean, the amount of time I'm spending on the semi-annual report from EarthChem CISA, I should not do it, but maybe it's going to make the annual report much easier.
But you need to push that down to us, the report. So Lucy and I should be writing the report, and then you should be coming back in and cleaning it up.
Well, I mean, I thought I did that, you know, there was, I mean, at least for the EL, there was a lot. What I've been working on today was trying to pull something out of Dave Stern, you know, I mean, we paid money to him. What has he done for EarthChem? And I really think he's just defensive about it, but he's primarily worked for GMRT and MGDS in my view, and Astromat. There isn't much for EarthChem. Anyway, I've been trying to get something from Ed about his contributions. I've written a long paragraph today about the whole project management and pulling Laura Springer in there. There is, you know, the reports from Peng, you know, give me content, but I need to write it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what you had written, I've taken. What Lucy had written, I've taken, you know, those, but it all needs to be put into
the next one too will be easier, because I do apologize that my stuff was still draft. Like I just wasn't sure what you wanted, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time.
And it was good.
It up if it wasn't the right tone and right
created
space.
one overarching sort of what has happened with respect to curation and so on, and then a whole list of small improvements. You know, all the stuff that was in the system releases. I mean, it's not small stuff, but you know, we had basically no money for new developments. So I'm getting very close now to upload it again so that others can add. I still have nothing from Karen Block, and I need to find the stuff from Gotcha and Roger. Roger had sent some summary, and I incorporated that about the training a new student and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's just a lot of pieces that need to come together.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get to it. I'm going to show my face, but I think my granddaughter is in bed by now.
Okay, yeah, and I have some other things that I'll bring up during the team meeting. I just, since Susan sent me that email now, I wanted to ask.
No, I really want to be at the meetings with DataCite and GBIF, and if at all possible with ORCID, which is probably then all the meetings we're going to have. Oh God, EarthChem is down again.
Oh no.
Yes, yeah, those are all the other things. Here is the invitation to present to this group at the the Arizona State University, who is doing the analytics and data management for this OSIRIS-REx.
Oh, that's
mission.
that's the thing that Lucy had been talking about. I think with one of her students.
They want me to give a presentation about the astromaterial data system to them, which is great, you know, but that's going to be December 1 when I'm already back in the US. So that's good. Okay.
Okay. Well, yeah.
All right.
Go enjoy
Talk to
your
you
time.
in an hour
Right.
again.
All right.
Exactly. Bye. Bye.